My name's Dr. Jonathan Vernon, and I've been a Brâncuşi scholar for more than 10 years now. Brâncuşi is often spoken about through the circumstances of his birth, which was in a hamlet called Hobița in Romania, 1876. He was born in quite hard conditions as a peasant, worked hard, I think left home at the age of 11, and ended up in Craiova and then Bucharest, sort of major European centres in Romania, studying at art academies, doing quite a sort of a classical education in the fundamental principles of drawing and sculpture and everything else. And he spent the first 30 years of his life in Romania, so it's a substantial part of his personality, of his roots. And then in 1904, he relocated to Paris, the same year as Picasso, walked most of the journey from Bucharest to Paris with some stops along the way, and was obviously entering the city at this time when artists from across Europe with different cultural backgrounds, just as Brâncuşi had, are gathering together, exchanging ideas in this storied cultural centre. So it's a really fertile moment. And so much of Brâncuşi's work, I think, is visible through this dual lens of both his roots and that cosmopolitan avant-garde environment that he finds upon his arrival in Paris. Within just a few years of reaching the capital, he's briefly apprenticed to Rodin, and famously, after a very short time under his tutelage, ends his relationship with Rodin and says, "Nothing can grow under the shadow of tall trees." In other words, Rodin's influence at that time was an enormous figure, the figure, a really paternal figure in French sculpture and French culture as a whole. Brâncuşi recognized that to cultivate his own vision, he needed to strike out on his own, do something new. We can see from sort of that point onward, around 1907, he begins to develop this highly individual idiom, but one that I think in important ways still very much takes what Rodin was doing and uses it as the basis for something new. You think of the fragmentation of form in general and figures in particular into heads and hands, torsos. Think about his use of quite actually like classical materials in many ways, in limestone and marble and bronze. And we can think also about the way that he treats the base and the pedestal, right? So much of Rodin's contribution was about taking the figure, off the pedestal, but down to the level of the viewer, making them ever more real, ever more part of our world. And Brâncuşi does something similar that in a way that again reaches back into his past, because he fabricates these specific bases and pedestals from wood and limestone with direct carving that in his mind he would have very much associated with a rich tradition of wood carving that's present in Romanian folk art, and gives the sculpture a completely different, renewed relationship to the floor, to the viewer. There are a few dynamics happening in early 20th century Paris insofar as there's just been the age of what's called the Great Excavations, where a lot of archaic and classical sculpture has become visible for the first time in large quantities in museum collections in Paris and all over Europe. There's also a lot of non-Western art that's been, including African art. Many of it entered these large collections like the Trocadero, the Museum of Ethnographic Art in Paris, as a result of colonialist endeavours. And there was definitely something in the air in the years after Brâncuşi arrived, wherein in the same way that direct carving as a technique seemed to lend itself to a certain kind of expressiveness, there was an innate expressiveness and concept that in other cultures, non-European cultures in particular, somehow those people were closer to nature, closer to an immediate expression of human emotion. I think above all, Brâncuşi's art, it's bringing in a lot of things from the outside. It's processing these ideas and perceptions, essences and differences, and creating something entirely new.